All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to another VQMS. Today, we're very excited to have Olivia Natan present her work. As a reminder, the panelists can feel free to interrupt at any time. And attendees, please use the Q&A feature to ask any questions, and we'll ask them on your behalf. And after the talk, we'll have a more informal discussion as usual. All right, kick it off, Olivia.
Thanks, Andre. Great. Okay, so thanks so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about this project on large product assortments. I'm Olivia Natan. I am at Berkeley in case we haven't met. Okay, so today, if you go online or offline, really, to try and buy a product in any given category, the sheer scope of product variety you face is potentially quite overwhelming. I actually had to update this slide recently, and some of these numbers actually doubled in the last year since I first made these slides. So if you're trying to buy shampoo at Target, prepare to search, essentially, is the takeaway. And when we think about trying to calculate the costs and benefits of offering more product variety, the economic approach has really typically taken a very one-sided view, in that it presumes that consumers will strictly benefit from more product variety. And they strictly benefit in a way that's actually direct. So there may be competitive effects to having more product variants or more folks in the market. But even as we think about how to model consumer demand for a given good or a basket of goods, the presumption is typically that consumers are better off when they face more product variants directly, either because they have heterogeneous tastes and therefore can find better match value in their product set, or they may directly value the consumption of product variety. And this is in contrast to the consumer behavior findings that are quite extensive now that suggest that variety is not always beneficial to consumers. In fact, there's large literature on choice overload primarily in lab experiments that studies that consumers make fewer purchases, so they may purchase at lower rates from larger assortments, and they may make worse purchases, so that the quality of the match that they find and their satisfaction with the product they've chosen is lower. But these have primarily been focused on very small-scale lab contexts. You know, the original experiment, which has been widely replicated, typically focuses on consumers making decisions between assortments of sizes, say 6 to 10 and around 20 products. Online, consumers faced orders of magnitude more product variants, and I think we should think very carefully about valuing this variety to the individual consumer. Now, the idea that more variety is not always beneficial to purchase rates is not novel, and it's not novel to the field, but there are sort of mixed empirical results from grocery retail. And so what I'm going to think about in this project is how to reconcile these two approaches to how consumers may interact with product variety. Okay. Now, offline, assortments typically are of fixed size or relatively fixed size, in that retailers face a fixed amount of physical shelf space, and expanding that shelf space can be quite costly. And so a lot of the work on offline assortments is really focused on optimization conditional on approximate assortment size, placement, this sort of thing. And these sort of shelf planning approaches presume that if they have more space, they should fill it up. Okay, so if a category manager could add more laundry detergent space to their assortments, they should do so. And in practice, though, there are several reasons that assortments are fixed, in addition to the large fixed cost of expanding shelf space. Operationally, a retailer may acknowledge that stocking more product variants can be more costly, have higher labor costs. And as a result, many retailers have tried thinking about something called SKU rationalization, where they reduce the number of stock products offline. But as I mentioned, this evidence on how this affects consumers has been somewhat mixed and low-powered. And some large retailers like Walmart have actually walked back their large-scale SKU rationalizations. This is really an offline-focused idea, though. Why don't we see this online? Online retailers have unlimited shelf space. And so potentially they may think that they should fill that shelf space as much as possible. So in this paper, I ask how larger product assortments affect individual consumption. I studied this in an online context. And when I think about when variety can actually be costly to consumers in real-world assortments, and when and how this cost of variety will arise even as consumers are experienced in a category. I'm going to do this within the context of a case study of an online restaurant delivery platform. Okay, so we're going to see field evidence of choice overload in large product assortments. And what specifically we're going to see is that more product variety, in terms of the number of restaurants that consumers face, increases the number of new customers that come to the platform. So product variety is beneficial in driving adoption of this platform, but it reduces the frequency of purchase among the large returning customer base, which is really where platforms earn a lot of their money. And that this cost variety is actually highest for consumers who order from a wide variety of restaurants or who proactively consume variety. And I see that returning customers are less likely to purchase in part due to the effect of variety on their search process. Search time is longer when they face larger product assortments. And then in a structural exercise, we're going to think about trying to pin down the mechanism by which more variety is going to be costly to consumers. And I find that the cost of information, which you can think about as sort of like a unit search cost, is unaffected by the size of the assortment. But that consumers' expectations about their match value, especially from untried products, are going to be much lower in larger assortments, which is going to reduce consumption. Now, online retailers and platforms have a huge opportunity here in that they can actually engage in assortment targeting, unlike, say, your local Walmart. And I find that targeting both the size and the contents of assortments can improve revenue by up to 50% for returning customers by primarily offering them considerably smaller assortments. And those assortments are going to be slightly higher margin, so that it enhances the frequency of purchase and the margin of purchase. Okay, I'm going to pause here before I dive in. Any questions at this point?
I have a dumb one, if you don't mind. I know that I'm jumping to the results, but you said people's beliefs about product quality are lower when there's a larger assortment. Is that for an individual product, or is that for the one they'll ultimately end up with, or is that an average?
So that's going to be their average expectation or subjective belief about match value for unsampled products. So their expectations, it's specifically the class of products that they haven't consumed.
Thank you.
Olivia, can I ask you, so just a big picture question here. So I guess the big difference between the online and offline world is that in online platforms like yours, people have access to kind of different filtering tools, searching tools. They can narrow down the list of their search results. So why is choice overload still a thing online? Like what is it about the design of your online platform that makes them overloaded with choice?
Great question. I'm going to come back to this. I'll give you a short answer now, and we can come back and talk about it after we think about the results a little bit. I think that it's impossible to disentangle in a given case study whether this is bad product design or choice overload per se. Where choice overload per se would be some sort of abstract idea about how people interact with individual items. But I think all the ways in which choice overload has been studied is specifically how consumers interact with a set of choices, and that set of choices has to be presented somehow. Okay, so it's possible that you could think that better search tools or easier to use search tools would ameliorate some of these effects, in the same way that there are lots of moderators of this effect in lab studies. And I'm not going to be able to exactly disentangle this, but I think some of this, I'll get back to this question when we get at the results.
Olivia, there's a question from Steve Dallas about whether this effect is non-monotonic potentially. And I guess I have a related question, which is that wouldn't it, if you knew ahead of time what the customer would prefer, there would always be an advantage to just showing the customer that product, and that would save them something. So what is the effect of that versus this additional effect of the overload?
Yeah, so first to Steve's question, this effect is actually seems to be the marginal effect seems to be fairly constant over the assortment size. So initially, when I started this project, I thought that my strong prior about the effect I was going to find was going to be this sort of like inverted U shape of variety, that initially more variety is beneficial, and then it starts becoming negative after a certain point. Instead, I find that pretty much uniformly over most of the support we're going to study, which I will get to in a moment, that the returns to variety and returning customers are negative. Honor, to your question, I mean, broadly, you could say, suppose that the platform or a retailer knew how to estimate preferences, why would they ever show consumers all their choices up front? I'm not going to directly address this. I think the idea that all of these platforms use some sort of recommendation agents, recommendation systems, and provide consumers with some recommendations quality unknown, I think, especially in this case, suggests that they acknowledge that there are costs to search, or that people aren't going to engage with hundreds of products at a given point in time. But maybe they're not the most sophisticated about it. Okay, let's talk about the case study. So I'm gonna have data from a single online restaurant delivery platform. These platforms are ubiquitous now, in that they have really boomed during the pandemic. What do? You use the website or the app to order delivery from a restaurant to your house. There are many of these platforms. I'm going to study one, and I'm going to assume it's a monopolist. I'll talk a little bit about competition and identification, but mostly we're going to think about this as sort of a monopoly platform world. How this works is that consumers go online and they type in their address when they want to make an order. They can see which restaurants are available to them. Those are primarily local restaurants. The restaurants in this case perform the delivery. And assortments in this context are personalized based only on the consumer's order location. So this is going to be sort of the main nice identification of these effects, is we're going to think about assortment variation across consumers based on their order location. There's a lot of changes to the actual variety consumers face in the time period I'm going to study, mostly due to restaurant entry onto the platform. This is distinct from offline restaurant entry, and then I'm going to be studying the time period in which many restaurants are entering this online market for the first time. And so a lot of the expansion is basically going to be the growth of this platform in inducing restaurant adoption for the first time. Not new restaurants, but new to the platform restaurants. And here, when I'm going to talk about product variety, I'm primarily going to only study the number of restaurants available on the platform. Okay. I, in the paper, also think about the number of attributes that are provided. We're not going to talk at all about the sort of the depth of the menu or the fact that consumers may also face choice overload when considering a given restaurant.
Olivia, are you able to say what years you have data from?
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to study this in two samples of consumers. First, we're going to look at all new consumers to the platform in LA area for 18 months in early 2015 and 2016. And then I'm going to look at the subset of consumers who don't immediately churn from the platform, i.e. who have 2 or more orders and some additional conditions over 3.5 years. Okay, so 2015 to 2018. Supplement this with detailed restaurant characteristics, including their exact delivery zone and demographic data. And sort of crucial to this context is that I'm going to exactly observe the restaurant's delivery zone and customer's location. So what happens is that restaurants, when they join this platform, choose the area to which they're willing to deliver. Because the restaurants are primarily the ones performing the delivery themselves with their own employees or contractors, the platform's understanding is that most restaurants choose their extant offline delivery zone when choosing their online delivery zone, or something very similar. And these are typically pretty uniform in size and centered around the physical premises of the restaurant. Okay, so you should think about them as being maybe about 3 to 4 kilometers in diameter. Not that they're all circles, but if they were circles, they would be about 3 to 4 kilometers in diameter around the restaurant's location. And this is going to allow me to construct the exact assortment a consumer would have faced if they went on the platform at any given time from a given location, even if they didn't search. So I'm going to think about assortment as being what could be generated if they did search. I'm not going to exactly observe search results. Okay. And in this context, consumers typically start out with a relatively modest assortment in early 2015. So this is a median of about 85 restaurants. This is pretty decently small assortment. And by the end of the panel, some of them face upwards of 600 restaurants. So there's an incredible amount of growth basically across the geographic board of consumers in LA during this time period, mostly due to offline restaurants signing up for the first time for online platforms. Now, I can pause here if there are any more case study questions, but I think it may be better to get into identification unless there's something urgent. Okay. So the primary challenge in identifying observationally the effect of more product variance on consumption and adoption here is that assortments are not randomly assigned. They're based on consumers' location. And the primary concern I'm going to think about controlling for here is consumer neighborhood selection. So people choose where they live in part based on local amenities, including restaurants. A preference for neighborhood amenities is likely going to drive some neighborhood choice within a large metro area like LA. Because delivery zones are centered typically around the physical premise, the offline restaurant density is going to be highly correlated with online restaurant density in this context. And this correlation between online and offline restaurant density is going to potentially spill over to ordering if consumers who are actively seeking out restaurant consumption choose to live in restaurant dense neighborhoods. So I'm mostly going to be concerned about this positive selection here. May also be a little bit concerned about strategic restaurant behavior that may affect timing or presence of offline competitors. I think that the strategic timing concern, which potentially that restaurants choose to enter this platform when they expect a lot of demand, is a little bit misplaced here, in that restaurants have very little control about their exact entry timing. The additional concern may also be that restaurants' delivery zones are not random. I'll get back to that in a couple slides. The main idea here is that we're going to control for user heterogeneity primarily based on geographic selection, but making very local geographic within neighborhood comparisons. So I'm going to have a large number of essentially entry experiments where a restaurant enters this platform. We're going to think about this entry as treating a bunch of consumers who either live in the surrounding areas or already are on the platform or potentially now have access to this restaurant. We're going to think about the marginal effect of entry, both of a given restaurant and locally around the restaurant's delivery zone border. So on the left, I have a given neighborhood, which we're going to think about as a zip code. Zip codes in LA are fairly small and uniform in size. Right, study them. So this zip code, the black dots here are a bunch of consumers in the data. The shaded gray area is the restaurant entry. So that these are all the new potential consumer restaurant matches that are induced by this restaurant entering the platform. The unshaded area are consumers who don't have access to this restaurant platform. So the main identification idea is to compare consumers who are around this border within the same neighborhood. There also is a lot of variation that would be thrown away if we only look around this border, because a lot of restaurant entry treats entire neighborhoods. That's what's shown on the right here. So the main thing we're going to think about, in identification is I want you to think about this essentially as a panel model of two-way fixed effects, where there are consumer specific effects and time specific effects. We're thinking about identifying the marginal effect of the assortment size on adoption or retention of existing customers. And we're going to make that comparison considerably more local by also adding neighborhood time effects and essentially studying only the subset of entry experiments that treat consumers on this border. Okay, what I find is that the effects of more variety on consumer adoption are positive across the board and across a variety of specifications. And then the effects on ongoing orders, which you could think of as weekly consumption or purchase frequency, are negative. Okay, and this is true regardless of whether we're studying the variation induced by all entry experiments or just studying consumers along these borders. Now, this negative effect of the number of product variants on frequency is strongest for the subset of consumers who are varying their purchases more. Okay, so you can think about there being essentially three broad types of returning customers: consumers who only use the platform to buy from a single or two restaurants, consumers who mostly buy from a small number of restaurants and occasionally vary, and consumers who change their purchases a lot, who are constantly switching between different products. This negative effect is strongest on the subset of consumers who are altering their purchase a lot between different restaurants. And there's essentially a very precise zero effect on the consumers who use this platform to buy a single product. So if all I do is I use this app to always order from the same Thai restaurant near my house, find very precise zero effect. And this is sort of consistent with potentially intuition that consumers who don't even see this contextual information about the assortment size because they just open the app, click on their recent purchase and reorder, are unaffected. This effect is also mostly being driven by the entry of independent local restaurants. So there's no effect for large California or national chains. And this is also crucially driven by the subset of products that consumer might actually interact with. So because I don't observe the exact search behavior of consumers, it's a little bit hard to think about what types of information consumers are actually interacting with. So what I did is I think about the set of restaurants that a consumer might actually realistically see in search results based on the set of products they consume. So if you only ever order pizza and Thai food, I partitioned all the entry experiments into only pizza and Thai entry and everything else. When I find this is driven only by the set of restaurant entry experiments that are in the product space that you actually consume from and that are likely to explore. And this is a little bit surprising. I thought that this is potentially driven, this negative effect on retention is potentially driven by vertical quality differences, but I at least observably, this does not seem to be the case. So the effect is quite similar across different restaurant Yelp ratings, which is my measure of quality. This is in contrast with some other studies of platform crowding, which suggest that as the number of products grow, it's easy to obfuscate quality, and thus this crowding effect is potentially driven by lower quality products entering. What I see is that highly rated and popular restaurants are just as deleterious to the frequency of purchase as low quality.
I have a question while you're on this. One aspect of quality here, right, is going to be the delivery service, the quality of the delivery. And so are you able to measure that in any way? Because you might imagine if you're entering a new platform, you're bad at delivering.
No, I'm not able to measure this. Also, I should note that this is also a very, at least the way what I'm studying right here is a very short-term effect. So this is essentially primarily identifies like the exact week after a restaurant enters. Now, two things that I think potentially driving this. One, even if new entrants, for example, are bad at delivery, for example, or bad at using the platform, they don't monitor it, et cetera, it's unlikely to show up in this data only because consumers are extremely unlikely to purchase from the new restaurants. So this is largely being driven by an effect on the purchase from incumbents, not purchase from new restaurants. The other thing is that this, while I can't observe delivery quality differences, so you might think that there's a set of restaurants that you enter and are exposed to and somehow are lower quality, this would seem to be captured by very strong restaurant-specific effects. And what I see, I'm not going to talk about here, but I think about this, there being sort of a distribution of these restaurant effects, and there does not seem to, the distribution of restaurant effects is not correlated as far as I can tell with any observables that would potentially be concerned here. Something that's on my to-do list is to think about whether this effect is really moderated by distance. So you might think that delivery quality is especially good for someone who's a restaurant consumer match that's very short distance. And so thinking about whether this effect is potentially positive for consumers who are very close to the restaurant.
And just more of a context related question. I know that this is an industry where there might be a lot of multi-homing across platforms. Was that the case during the time of your sample? And are the entrants more or less likely to be multi-homing?
Great. So I don't observe exactly the multi-homing behavior of restaurants or consumers. Let's chat about the both. Okay, first from the restaurant perspective, based on this platform survey and my attempts to read restaurants talking about how they think about this, though restaurants do multi-home, it's very, very rare that they would be simultaneously entering both platforms or multiple platforms at the same time. So this could be a marginal platform, additional platform for an already online restaurant. This also could be their first time entering. I can't see this, but I think it's extremely unlikely that these short-term effects are driven by restaurant multi-homing. The larger concern is potentially if restaurants multi-home or if consumers multi-home, how do we think about interpreting these effects? This is mostly being driven by a substitution to what I call the outside option, which is going to be a composite of eating at home, eating physically in a restaurant, calling the restaurant, or using other platforms. These consumers likely do multi-home. My assumption is that this marginal effect is the key assumption to identify this separately from sort of the effects of competing platforms is just that the treatment is not exactly aligned with changes to the competing platforms. So I think because So as a given restaurant enters, the assumption is that there are parallel trends in the offline and other online availability of local restaurants to consumers in a given neighborhood. Given the lack of exact overlap in timing, I think that makes sense given how narrow a time window is.
Can I ask a quick question? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Nick.
Oh, I have a question about the user experience. So when the consumer opens the app, what do they see? So I'm thinking like, I'm not great with technology, but like when I like do the Uber Eats or whatever, like I have no idea how many restaurants there are. And like on Amazon, I had no idea how many toothpastes there are. So like, I'm wondering like, you said that a pretty constant marginal effect is get big. I mean, is that number shown to consumers? Like how much search are they doing where they could experience these?
So if you just open the app, you would not see how many restaurants are available to you. You would see likely during most of this time period, you would see your recent orders sort of in a carrel, and then maybe like recommendation carrels, which are going to vary a lot, or promotional carrels. What you do see is if you engage in any type of search, even search without keywords, you see the number of pages of restaurants that are returned at the top. And during some time periods, you would actually see the number of search results. So consumers conditional on searching should see this and potentially see this information.
On the same note, like, so does the website promote restaurants that just joined, or like, do we know anything about how?
Yes, so they do. I'm not sure it's actually a bandit, but during this time period, you could think about it as them trying to engage in some sort of bandit-like behavior with new entrants to learn about their quality. So they will stochastically show some new restaurants at the top of search results, though not typically like one. So it's not.
So how does that affect?
And you see all the new restaurants.
How does that affect the identification strategy? If it's, can the result come from this promotion of the new restaurants?
Potentially, the effect could, especially if what you see is that there's a large effect conditional on search. So I don't see exact search information, but okay, we're gonna get to this. We're gonna talk. I don't see exact search information. I just see whether or not consumers searched, a binary measure. And this is the identification concern you're talking about is inconsistent with what I'm going to find there. So can I get back to 2 slides?
Olivia, can I ask a basic clarification question on the results about order frequency? So this is order frequency by people who were on the platform before entry. So it's not people who adopted because of the new entrant. This is pre-existing customers.
Yes, this is existing customers. This is 6 months of first-time customers. After that 6 months, essentially, their ongoing behavior.
Got it. Thank you.
So Olivia, I can ask a quick question too. So when I think about choice overload in the context of kind of this whole behavioral literature we had, I usually think about large changes, right? So in the original Stanford GEM experiment, they increased the assortment size like 3-4 times. Now here, if I understood correctly, this is more about kind of isolating incremental variation of like there's the new restaurant entering that slightly increases the size of my choice set. So how do you take that local variation and extrapolate it to make inference about choice overload? And I guess under what kind of assumptions do I need to make for that to work? Because small changes probably don't matter, but if I increase your choice set 10 times, that's gotta have some effects, right?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the way I think about this is that I'm trying to identify essentially the curve of marginal responses. So I don't show that in these slides, but as you think about there as being this curve in there, it's this effect, marginal effect is consistently negative. Now, whether you can extrapolate from 30 restaurants to 300 restaurants, just based on this marginal curve, does require the idea that consumers who are experiencing these effects at very different supports for assortment size are similar, and that they're similar in ways that we're never going to observe in the data. So that's going to be the primary. And the structural part is going to rely a little bit on extrapolation of that flavor.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so most of the purchase reduction here, this frequency reduction, occurs for restaurants that consumers have never tried before. So you can think that consumer faces 3 types of restaurants when they go online: a set of restaurants that they've consumed from in the past on this platform, incumbent restaurants that they haven't tried, and the new set of restaurants they also, by definition, haven't tried because they are new. This reduction in purchase frequency is happening primarily through incumbent unsampled products. Okay, so products that were online, available to me online in the past, but I haven't tried. And this search, so I'm not going to be able to directly think about this as a search mechanism since I only observe whether they start search, but what I see is that consumers begin their search process less frequency. They start a search less frequently as the choice set expands, but that conversion into purchase is very similar. Okay. What does this mean? It means that they start search sessions at a considerably lower rate, and a rate that is pretty consistent with the reduction in total consumption. And I don't see any effect on the probability of order conditional on search. Now, this is a little bit in conflict with what we were talking about. How do consumers learn this information about the assortment size, especially if they don't search? And this effect is also a little bit inconsistent with what a lot of lab studies have found. So the lab finding essentially is that when consumers see more products, they become more interested in the set of products, they sort of engage or attend to the products more, but they convert at a much lower rate, which suggests that there's some friction at the point of making a decision. What I see here, at least in the short run window, is that the effect is in fact the opposite. Consumers engage in search for the first time at a lower rate, but conditional on searching, potentially I'm very hungry, I'm trying to order dinner. So maybe you don't see this very short-term effect on decision rate. This doesn't rule out the fact that consumers maybe are engaged in some sort of intertemporal effect, okay? So one way to think about this is that consumers are unaware exactly of the size of the assortment if they don't go online. Okay? So you can think about there being the true set of products that they would see if they went online, and also what they might extrapolate from their past experience. They have rational expectations about the assortment growth for the assortments that they will face today. So if I've experienced expanding assortments over time, I might expect expansion in the future. And so if you think about this, there being the effect of the growth of the assortment since my last time online and the growth, historical growth till today, this assortment size growth decomposed into these 2 pieces both reduce consumption. One is the growth that I experienced last year, and the other is growth that I might expect today. And so this carryover effect from past assortment expansion, just that potentially consumers are learning something about the effects of assortment size on their own consumption experience. And so what I'm don't test here, but I think is a really interesting area for future work, is to think about whether the spillers from search experience are experienced intertemporally. So what happens to consumers when they face larger assortments conditional on search, spend a considerably longer time searching prior to purchase. So I don't see exactly what they search, but I see that the total duration of search, and that duration is increasing. And then conditional on last period, consumers having experienced really high search duration, they reduce their subsequent purchase likelihood in the next period. Okay. So yesterday I arrived, I faced a larger choice set than I did in the past. I searched for longer. I ultimately purchased. This reduces my probability of engagement in the future. This is purely suggestive, but I think this is potentially getting to how consumers may show up this effect on the margin in the short term, even without engaging with the platform in the first place.
Just one clarification. I mean, there is work on fatigue that says, even absent this idea that there's a lot of information, and so that affects my search. It's just because I searched a lot in the past, even keeping constant the number of options that are available. But just because I searched a lot in the past, I'm tired. And so I'm going to search much less in the future. So
yes,
I know you don't observe that, but
we don't observe that. I don't observe that, but that would be very consistent with how this could occur in this data, in that consumers are marginally searching for longer due to the assortment expansion, and then due to their longer search experience.
I guess you could test like whether, for people who were for whom the assortment doesn't change. Like there might be some people, I don't know, for some
Yes.
period the assortment doesn't change, but you still see this pattern.
Fatigue. Yeah.
I have another dumb question. I'm sorry. I'm not gonna get another invite back, am I? What's the outside option here? So if I'm not ordering from the app, am I cooking at home or am I calling the restaurant directly?
I treat non-purchase as a combination of a number of things: eating at home, calling the restaurant, using another platform, going to a restaurant in person. Could be any of these things. Okay, so I can't really disentangle just from these regression results what's going on here. So it's possible essentially that consumers face higher search costs, which may induce the type of fatigue Roka was talking about. It also is possible that there are actual matches going down as the assortment expands. So I can't really distinguish just in regressions this distinction between preference and search costs. What I do distinguish is that there's no observable price or quality difference between entrants and incumbents, and there's no, you can think about there being no interaction effect essentially of the price level of entrants or the quality level of entrants. Okay. Questions before we get into the structural bit? So I'm going to approach this structural exercise with two goals. One is to think sort of managerially how this platform can address their retention issues by an increased purchase frequency for the returning customers where they make most of their money. As first-time consumers essentially are primarily bought. All these platforms have incredible first-time purchase deals. So let's consider that they know how to acquire new customers and think about how to retain them. And I'm also going to nest a test of how these larger assortments reduce purchase frequency for returning customers. The general setting here is that consumers are going to be rationally inattentive. They're going to make discrete choices among no purchase option, which I've just described, and platform restaurants. And here, choice overload effect that I've found in the regression is going to rise either due to changes to the cost of information, which will in turn change which information consumers acquire and what they purchase, or to their expectations. So from a consumer's perspective, how does this model operate? Consumer arrives every period, they form subjective beliefs about product values, okay? These subjective beliefs are essentially unrestricted, though we're gonna parameterize them as a function of some observable characteristics. Then conditional on their prior expectations about product valuations, they're gonna create an info collection strategy, essentially a search strategy, and execute that, update their posterior beliefs, make a product choice. And then their consumption experience is potentially going to inform tomorrow's beliefs. Now, what is this information collection strategy? Here, you should think about this as being essentially continuous, a form of continuous search, okay? It's not that a consumer clicks on it on a given restaurant's page and immediately learns everything there is about their payouts from that restaurant. Instead, I may spend time even looking at a given restaurant in the listing of search results, or conditional on clicking on a restaurant's page, may not completely search it. Now, search costs here are going to be increasing in the amount of information obtained. So consumers will never have full information about any product offerings. And the sort of allocation of energy, search energy across products may not follow the exact same as we might think about it, sort of like a Weitzman type model. Instead, consumers are going to attend to the products where gaining that information will maximize their expected payoffs by essentially distinguishing between products that are ex ante identical. And I'm going to allow the assortment size directly, essentially, to impact the cost of information here, potentially, and their subjective prior expectations. Now, what does that look like from the researcher's perspective? A lot of this is unobserved, okay? So consumers' expectations, unobserved, their information collection strategy and the information they collect, also unobserved. We do observe as consumers' product choices. So the key assumption here, I think, sort of economically, is that consumers are going to respond differently to the set of information that they have prior to search and the set of characteristics that they have to search over. Okay. And so the key assumption is going to, and we'll talk about what are in each of these sets of product characteristics, is what information do consumers have prior to search and that is incorporated into their subjective beliefs, and what has to be searched and therefore is going to be moderated by changes to the search cost. And here, I'm not going to directly put the size of the choice set into consumption utility. Okay, so it's going to affect choice probabilities both through information collection and through expectations. This is going to nest tests of the marginal effects of the assortment size and allow me to decompose this effect potentially into the cost of information, the cost of assortments on expectations. Okay, what does this look like? There's essentially three pieces to these discrete choice probabilities in this empirical, rational, and attention model. First is consumers' integrated expectations. This is this pie term. This is their ex-ante probability of choice of each option prior to search. There's a search cost, which is we're gonna think about there being inverse of search costs, and then there's gonna be consumption utility. So consumption utility, think of as exactly what we think of in lots of discrete choice settings. The information cost essentially is going to moderate changes in observable consumption utility on the probability of choice. And then the expectation is essentially going to, these expected subjective beliefs are essentially going to be a residual term. I want to think about this generally as a residual term, and that the set of changes to choice probabilities are choices that are unexplained by observable factors that impact consumption utility. Okay, so we're going to parameterize these so that this model ends up looking a lot more like a regular logit model. Three things. First, these expectations. The expectations we're going to allow to be a function of the size of the choice set, wide variety of time effects, and consumers' choice histories. So here, there's not going to be any choice history or you can think about this lag choice in the utility function. Instead, it's going to factor directly into the expectations. And a proxy for on-platform advertising. So I don't see exactly where products rank at any given time in the search function, but this measure is going to proxy for how high they would be in search results. Consumption utility is unknown ex ante to consumers. It's going to be a function of price, distance between the restaurant and the consumer, and cuisine characteristics. Consumers have to pay, essentially the assumption here is that consumers need to spend some effort to attend to these characteristics to learn about them, even if some of them don't change frequently, for example, distance for delivery. Finally, we're going to let search cost be a function of the size of the choice set and the unemployment rate in the area, which you think of as a proxy for the cost of time. So to estimate this, I'm going to use this new Bonhomme, Laminon, and Manresa technique, which says that we're going to approximate potentially continuous heterogeneity across units with a finite dimensional representation. To do this, you use k-means clustering essentially to split consumers into, or units into groups ex ante and estimate uniform parameters within groups. This is going to be the only source of essentially unobserved parameter heterogeneity in the model. So there's going to be observed parameter heterogeneity in the model, and this is observables and summary statistic based clustering of people into segments, essentially. We do inference by simultaneously doing this estimation and the counterfactuals within a subsampling routine. And this is going to allow me to test nested model restrictions of a bunch of different forms of this model. So I'm going to compare an unrestricted model to versions that restrict the cost of information, essentially the search cost, or beliefs about product payoffs to be invariant to assortment size. What I find essentially is that unit information cost is not impacted at all by assortment size. So we should think about this as being consumers' relative sensitivity, conditional on purchase to product characteristics, is not affected by the growth of the assortment. Okay, this is the type of variation that will identify this. As the assortment expands, consumers do not become less price sensitive, for example, directly as due to this search cost term. Instead, what I see is that expectations about payoffs from some subsets of restaurants are lower as the assortment grows, specifically the set of incumbent untried restaurants, which is exactly what we found in the regression portion. But this marginal effect is very small. So what I've plotted here is the distribution of across consumers of the marginal effect of assortment growth on the probability of non-consumption. You can see that while this is positive for nearly, in fact, this is a smoothing issue, it's positive for all consumers, but the effect is very, very small on the margin. So to Ilya's question earlier about how much are we extrapolating from marginal effects at 300 to 30, the answer is essentially going to be a lot. So I'm going to assume that this marginal effect that I recover here is uniform across assortment size, even as we potentially enter the counterfactual world where I'm offering assortments considerably smaller than a consumer would ever actually face in the data.
Olivia, can I ask a different question? So I'm kind of still trying to wrap my mind around the model. Can you talk more about the mechanics of this model? For example, you have some budget of attention you're basically allocating to different restaurants. What happens exactly when the number of restaurants increases? Is it that I allocate all my attention to the most popular restaurants? Is it that I spread it kind of evenly across restaurants? Is this about not learning enough, learning about wrong options? What is going on?
Yes. So you could think about the empirical model as being essentially quite agnostic to that. So there's no sense in which this is this is sort of not as detailed in the empirical version as you would expect in other types of search models. What will be happening mechanically is sort of an estimation, essentially, is that if, for example, hypothetically, the search costs did increase because consumers have to spend longer scrolling, there are strong position effects, they're trying to find the restaurants, reasons that you might expect there to be effects on search, marginal effects on search, then consumers will marginally attend less to, i.e. continuously reduce their attention across many restaurants, or many searches, and thus become less sensitive to post-search characteristics. So there's no sense in which this is going to induce consumers potentially to like switch attention from being very positive from one product to zero. Now, what's happening in the subjective expectations is that essentially this is a residual term, which is going to reduce. So if consumers' expectations are lower for products that they haven't tried in the past, as the assortment expands, because their expectations about payoffs are lower, they will attend, their endogenous attention will reduce for those products because the probability of that being the selected product post-search is lower. So you can think about them. This is going to manifest, especially in the presence of different beliefs for sampled and unsampled products, more attention, relatively more attention to products that consumers have experienced with in the past and thus have a higher expectation about their fails.
So I said I was going to shut up and I'm not, and I
No,
apologize.
please.
Can I just make sure I'm on the same page? So the idea is that as a consumer, I look through the app, I order something, and then afterwards, when I'm thinking about should I order something again, I think both about like the food was good and also it was really annoying to scroll through a whole bunch of stuff, and that influences my likelihood of opening the app and ordering again.
Yes. So and conditional on opening the app, it makes me more likely to focus on products that I don't have to search for.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I didn't talk about this in the reduced form stuff, but what I see is that this large effect on search duration is very strong for consumers who ultimately are actually trying a new product. So search time, the total search duration for repeat purchase is very small. So this is consistent with the idea that consumers may get some information for free on the homepage. There are a set of products they've recently ordered.
Sorry, and one more question. I don't know if you addressed this, but how do you separate the effect of assortment on, this utility versus the search cost part? Is it through the functional form or?
Yes. Okay. So there are two things that are going to give us identification. One is the relative responsiveness, conditional on my assumption about what consumers get for free information-wise. their relative responsiveness to post-search or attention costly characteristics, and functional form beliefs to get us to an estimatable equation. This functional form, the main way this bites is essentially the assumption about the functional form of information cost, which the idea is that the reduction in entropy in your expectations, the more you reduce your entropy in your expectations by paying attention, the higher the search costs, and that's increasing in attention. And so the effect essentially is identified conditional on these functional form assumptions on marginal changes to marginal sensitivity to utility characteristics. So for example, some of the price variation is driven by tax increases. So suddenly, Long Beach raises their taxes, restaurants in Long Beach are marginally more expensive. If search costs are higher, what's going to happen is that consumers are differentially less responsive to that price increase. So what we're going to do with this is think about how the platform can improve sales for the returning customers. The idea here is we're going to offer existing customers targeted, potentially much smaller choice sets. We're going to target these choice sets on a couple of different things. One is going to be platform's objective function, which I'm going to assume is revenue from sales. We're also going to target, for example, on just total sales or on consumer utility. I'm going to compare offering everyone the same assortment size to individual specific assortment sizes. It turns out because consumers are sort of similarly sensitive to assortment size for the most part, this ends up not mattering too much. Okay, and what I find is that the best case for the platform is to target on expected revenue, but this is going to be extremely similar in practice to target based on just sales, okay? This improves revenue by about 50% in the best case, and this improves sales by about 30%. Now, why is targeting based on revenue and targeting based on quantity very similar, and why is that interesting? I think that the thing to note here is just that many recommender systems are targeting based on quantity. So essentially the predictions of this model are that you should offer people smaller choice sets. The set of things that you offer them is very similar to the set of things that a recommender system might try and train on. Okay. What happens here is that consumers now experience considerably smaller assortments. This reduction is really salient when you target in these red and teal boxes based on either quantity or revenue. If you target just based on consumption utility or target at random, you end up needing to show consumers much larger assortments to get them to buy at a higher rate, sort of optimally. In part, that's because targeting just based on utility characteristics is not taking into account choice history, and it's not taking into account the direct effect of, potentially the direct effect of the assortment reduction on consumption. Now, what happens here is that in the optimal case, most consumers are now facing very, very small choice sets. So this is relying a lot on extrapolation. If you can figure out consumers' most likely purchases in the first place, targeting directly on this means that I'm just going to, in this model, show people 10 or 20 restaurants that they're most likely to buy. Okay. This is potentially a little bit of an extreme example. Okay, so the platform, when I talked to them, was not interested in implementing this. Not because they think that 10 restaurants is too few, but they weren't even interested in reducing choice sets at all. I think that the idea that we could stop showing consumers some, maybe even just half their choices, the ones that we predict they are never going to consume, is not so controversial, in part because consumers are never even exposed to many of those products in the first place. But best I can do. So what I do in this project is I think about how assortment expansion impacts product category or platform adoption, and it reduces purchase frequency for the existing customers. And that existing customer base is where these platforms earn a lot of their money. Why is this happening? Well, larger assortments reduce the frequency for these returning customers, in part because their expectations about their total utility from unsampled products are lower. The interpretation here can go two ways. One is that consumers literally believe that the payoffs from the same incumbent untried products are lower, or this expectation is reflecting a more subjective belief about the payoffs net of search costs. And reducing assortments in a targeted manner can be highly effective, essentially by getting rid of completely irrelevant restaurants for existing consumers. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Olivia. There are a few questions that I will start asking from the audience. And if anyone in the audience would like to be promoted to a panelist, raise your hand and someone will promote you. All right, so a very early question from Pranav Jindal. How do these results generalize to grocery products where customers repeatedly purchase some products and brands? I think this is just a general question about external validity. So.
Yeah, sure. So part of the reason I think that this is the reason I think this is a nice place to study this is a context in which A, consumers are making discrete choices, so we're not really directly concerned about sort of basket effects. And B, consumers actually may directly value variety. They just may not value it in the same time period. So consumers do engage in lots of variation in their consumption. And so what I see here is that even consumers who I think sort of we might classify as value variety in that they alter their consumption among products a lot, seem to have this effect be strongest in part because engaging in consumption of variety necessitates search. And so if this mechanism is due to the pain of searching in these contexts, then we would expect consumers who are actively seeking variety in other contexts, this effect may be salient. I think the challenge in extrapolating to basket context is that consumers by definition consume variety. And so I'm not sure you would necessarily see this on the margin sort of at the grocery retailer level. But most of this has been studied at the category level in groceries. The challenge, of course, is that offline retailer can't engage in this sort of assortment targeting. So I think online grocery is a great potential application for this within category.
All right, thanks. A couple of questions about the details of search. Tesseri asks whether it's active search versus browsing. And Sergey Turlo asks whether you allow for endogenous consideration set formation.
Sure. So here, I use the word search when I really mean attention. So this is potentially encapsulating both active, you might think about directed search where consumer enters a keyword with a specific product category or subset of characteristics in mind and goes through those results. That's encapsulated as is sort of generic browsing, as if I open the entire assortment essentially and look through this. So both of these are captured in this model, that there's no sense of, this model does not allow for the idea that directed search is by definition a different search and choice process from browsing. Okay, Sergey's question. There's no consideration set nature in this model. This could, to the extent that consumers engage in consideration set type search, this could be essentially captured implicitly through how the model returns results, in that products that are not in the consideration set are given very low subjective expectations. I don't think this is driving results, but I think that's possible.
There's a question from Omid about recommender systems, and I guess in particular, new restaurants might be poorly measured by a recommender system, and so they might treat them not in an optimal way as they would in the future after some set of learning. So I guess could this drive some of your results?
Yeah, so I think that's a big limitation, at least of the counterfactual idea, which is that the platform essentially has as much information as I, the researcher, do about restaurant consumer match. Okay, you could think about maybe doing a very restricted version of this exercise in which the platform has only a limited amount of data to do the preference estimation, and then also has choice histories and is making guesses based on that. I think that would essentially give very similar results, in part because I think a recommender system is always going to have choice histories And choice histories are extremely predictive of the types of things that you should show customers. In terms of valuing new restaurants, I think the probability of purchase from a new, say there are 2 restaurants that enter your area in a given week. There were already 200 restaurants. The probability that you were in the data going to purchase from a new restaurant is ex ante so low that though it may be in the platform's long-term incentive to learn quickly about new restaurants, in the short term, I think this model will say that you shouldn't ever show people new restaurants unless they look very, very similar to restaurants we know they like. This is a drawback. I also don't asked about controlling for the recommendation system on the platform. In the first half of this data, there essentially was no recommender system. They had not really implemented this, and there was no idea of like personalized search ranking, for example. So I don't directly control for the model. I can say that even as the platform, for example, becomes more advanced over time, you think they improve their UX, they improve their search ranking, their recommendations. I look at the marginal effect over time in the 3-year period, and I see this is pretty constant. But this is happening when the platform is poorly designed, and it's still happening when the platform is better designed later.
Is there a label for new restaurants that's very salient in the interface? Because I know that sometimes that's common, and that might cause people to waste a lot of effort.
New badge.
Yeah, that might attract the effort, and if it wasn't, maybe a big part of the problem is just the badge. I don't know.
Yes, that could be an issue. I mean, so then the platform faces this trade-off between their platform level learning and the individual payoffs, which is hard.
I have a question about, so if I'm not great at math, so I apologize if I'm misunderstanding, but my understanding is that the reason that the larger assortments are leading to negative utility is because people think that the unsampled options are not going to be very good. Whereas you could imagine maybe a different version of this story, which is sort of like the experience I have when I'm just clicking through Netflix and looking at all the titles, which is that I just think there's something better out there. And I'm just like, I can't pull the trigger because I'm disappointed in the fact that I haven't found the best thing. I'm wondering if there's a way to like separate those ideas empirically. Because the reason I ask this is because I think that like the solution of reducing choice set size, like I've traveled to places where you open like Uber Eats and there's like 3 restaurants and I ain't very happy.
Yes. So it should be very clear that the proposal of reducing choice set size is that if you live in downtown LA and have 400 restaurants, the claim here is that showing you the 20 best predicted restaurants for you is much better than showing you 400 restaurants. What mechanically is happening is that if you don't eat sushi, it's never going to show you sushi restaurants. I don't think this is super controversial. Essentially, it's doing filtering for consumers. That being said, there potentially are signaling effects of showing people small assortments if they assume that this is all the variety. If their experience is that when I look at 30 restaurant assortment, it's bad because I'm in the boonies, potentially a problem. This idea of like continuation value of search, I think is very interesting, though is maybe unlikely to be relevant in this market. I think it's very relevant in other markets. So here, what seems to be happening is that descriptively, if consumers start search trying to find something new, it's taking a long time, they end up buying something they've tried in the past. Because unlike maybe online media consumption, there's an extreme amount of repeat consumption. I just was attempting to try a new restaurant and realized that I should always order from the same burrito place. I think there is one more question in the Q&A. Oh, the question's about sort of like two-sided network effects. Okay, so the idea here is that, and the sort of key identification assumption is that the distribution of consumers on the margin of these delivery zones is not, is essentially not marginal to the restaurant's decision. Also, I'm primarily studying a very small subset, essentially, of the platform's market, because I'm studying a single cohort over time. And so certainly the number of consumers on the platform is potentially going to drive entry of restaurants. This is unlikely to drive entry of restaurants relevant to the 6-month cohort of consumers.
Any other questions?
Just a follow-up question on the whole supply side discussion. I actually find that fascinating to think about. So I know yours is kind of a demand side paper here. I find fascinating to think about whether the platform would have incentives to actually remove the choice overload instead of just keeping it in place. For example, you might want to have some consumers just kind of randomly stumbling upon restaurants and doing random search, right? Because that's how that's the only way in which some of the worst restaurants can get their demand and can find customers. And that's good for the supply side because those restaurants now participate and you have your variety on the platform. So it's very relevant to your counterfactuals, right? Because you are thinking, well, the platform wants to reduce choice overload, whereas it's not that obvious that they would want to.
Well, yes and no. Okay, so if there are restaurants that marginally would be beneficial for some customers, and the platform, of course, has an incentive to ensure that they participate in the market. But if they're really low quality restaurants, so I think there's sort of like a vertical versus horizontal thing here. If there is something that's offering like a new horizontal attribute, then the platform has a great incentive to ensure that this will be on the platform and will meet some small segment of consumers. If a restaurant would be never recommended to anybody, it's unclear to me why the platform has an incentive to keep them. I don't know what your thoughts are on this.
You may get all the advertising revenues from them. But anyway, I think that there's a nice supply side exercise you can do, but maybe that's an idea for a follow-up paper.
Because I study essentially such a small group of consumers, I can't really draw any conclusions about, for example, whether counterfactually some restaurants now don't face any consumers. Now, there are like 12,000 something restaurants, and say in the structural model I study, a couple thousand consumers. So of course there are restaurants that aren't going to have consumers, but there are thousands and thousands and thousands of unstudied customers who they would likely potentially see.
Olivia, I don't think you talked about this, but customers can directly navigate to this platform from the restaurant's website. So there might be an incentive for them to participate, even if they never get any of their customers from the recommendation/search feature.
Yes, that is a good point. I also I think that practically the recommendation I would take away from this is that there should be some trimming of trimming of choice sets, but you should never, for example, prevent a consumer from navigating to a restaurant they're specifically interested in. This is not included in the model, but is very, I think, and this would be both from the restaurant's website, or if I type in the name of the restaurant and search for it. There's no reason to prevent that from happening. But I think this is more about a reflection on the difficulty of navigating large sets of search results.
All right, well, thank you for joining, everyone.
Thanks for having me. This is super cool.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.